Hello, my name is Sandra Walters Malone, and I'm an Episcopal priest in the Diocese of the Virgin Islands. My diocese is a little different from most in that it's made up of two countries, the British Virgin Islands and the U.S. Virgin Islands. There are 14 congregations spread over 5 islands, and I serve on Tortola, which is the main island in the British Virgin Islands. I'm the vicar of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Seacows Bay. I have the privilege of being part of two of the most beautiful countries. I'm a native of Barbados, and this year makes 30 years that I've been living in the BVI. I think it's still early enough for me to wish you a Happy New Year. I'm sure you would agree with me that the year 2020 was one like no other. I checked with dictionary.com, and unsurprisingly, their word of the year was the word pandemic. A word that describes a disease that is prevalent throughout an entire country, a continent, or the world. Subscribers also had their chance to weigh in, and their choice of the top word for the year was unprecedented. Little surprise, as it seems as though it was used everywhere we turned. The word polling the second highest number of votes was lockdown, followed by chaos and chaotic. When you live in a place as beautiful as the BVI, it can be hard to relate to some of the suffering being experienced around the world. And yet we are not unaffected. Our borders were closed in March of last year when the impact of COVID-19 first began to be really seen. I was in Colorado at the time for a 2-week visit. 2 weeks that stretched into 4 months before my son and I were able to return home. We have had relatively few cases here in the BVI, 107, with 14 currently positive and 1 death. But everyone here knows someone who has been directly affected. And as a territory that depends heavily on tourism, we too are feeling the fallout. Some people have lost their jobs, while others are making the difficult choice between paying their rent and feeding their families. And if the chaos created by the pandemic hasn't been enough of a challenge to our equilibrium, we all witnessed the pandemonium at the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday, a scene that reverberated around the world. There's a saying here in the Caribbean that when America sneezes, we catch a cold. The social climate of the U.S. affects us, as we all have relatives and friends who live in that reality. And the economic climate also affects us, as we are dependent on the importation of both goods and tourists. The words of the 17th century Anglican priest and poet John Donne come to mind as a reminder of our interconnectedness. He wrote, "No man is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or of thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore seek not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." Too often we fail to see our actions or reactions, or even our lack of action, in a wider context. And we forget that things said and done have a ripple effect. And even when we are conscious of that fact, we discount the impact of our own actions, dismissing them with a commentary that one person can't make any real difference. Dare I beg to differ? Dare I remind us of Francis of Assisi, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Jesus Christ? In spite of all that I have seen and heard that seeks to persuade me otherwise, I still have hope. We've just come out of the liturgical seasons of Advent and Christmas, during which we focused on the gifts of hope, peace, joy, and love that God offers us. When we focused on the ultimate gift, God incarnate coming into the world to be one of us, entering into our reality to share our human condition with all its positives and negatives, feeling hunger and pain and loneliness, feeling joy and compassion and love. The NIV rendering of John 1:14 tells us that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Eugene Peterson's interpretation in the Message Bible says that God moved into the neighborhood. I like that. To me, it implies relationship. It implies intimacy. So how do we live once we are conscious that Emmanuel is here, that God is with us? How do we behave in our own homes when we are aware that our neighbor lives near enough to hear us, to see us? Perhaps we are less inclined to shout. Perhaps we bite our tongues when we are tempted to use certain words. If the awareness of a human neighbor has such an impact on our lives, how much greater should be the impact when we have an awareness of the presence of God? Often we want to compartmentalize our lives. We want to separate what we count as secular from what we count as sacred. But all parts of our lives are sacred. When we are in relationship with God, God inhabits every facet of our lives. Every word, every action should be influenced by that relationship. Whether we are bowed in prayer, or as Brother Lawrence, we are scrubbing pots. Everything should be a testament of God's love for us and for the world. From time to time, I remind my congregation that left to itself, love is an abstract noun, something the dictionary defines as having no existence. Love only becomes concrete when it becomes a verb, a doing word. In Luke 4, as he begins his public ministry, Jesus quotes these words from Isaiah 61. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." It is interesting to note that in Matthew 25, he uses the same criteria as a measuring stick for those who are described as righteous. Jesus says, "The king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?' Jesus continues, the king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.' In other words, our relationship with God is manifested not only in our worship, but also in our service. We are called to both love God and to love our neighbor. I think it's a timely reminder as we begin this new year, a year that has begun with great drama and the promise of challenges that will need to be faced and worked through. It seems almost as though, along with the Christmas decorations, we've packed away the peace and the goodwill that we proclaimed during that season. But the American prophet Howard Thurman reminds us that it is now that the work of Christmas truly takes place. In Christmas moods, he writes, "When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among others, to make music in the heart. It is now in this season that our work truly begins. It is now in the midst of all that may offend us that we must remind ourselves that we are all created in God's image, that God loves and calls us to be channels of that love, that God charges us with being reconcilers in a broken world. It may be easy to throw up our hands and give up, to be tempted to take our toys and go home. But that is not really an option, because for those of us who claim to follow Christ, love is not an option. We are mandated to love God. We are also mandated to love our neighbor. And this year may give us a prime opportunity to show that love at a time when we are challenged by others who oppose us, by others who think differently from us, by others who behave differently. We are called to hold up a standard, to hold up the standard of love, and to live our lives in a way that shows God to others, in a way that draws others to God. From my part of the world to yours, wherever you are, I wish you an awareness of God's presence. And I pray that that awareness will permeate every facet of your life. Through all that 2021 may bring, I wish you God's shalom. I'm Sandra Walters Malone. Blessings on you.